Tim, you ready to get started?
Let's go.
All righty. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're joining us from. My name's Meg Steiner. If I haven't met you already, I'm our VP of Marketing here at Richardson, and I'm going to be our host for our 30-minute webinar on recharging your sales process with sales agility. Before we jump in, as always, two quick reminders. We've reserved a couple of minutes towards the end of the webinar for Q&A. So as we go along and Tim's talking about this great content, feel free to submit your questions along the way using either the Q&A feature or the chat feature, and I'll take those down and be sure to answer those at the end. And as always, we are recording today, so we will plan to send this to all attendees. Right after this session ends, Sarah Doherty will be sending that email out, so you can expect that from her. So let's introduce our team today. First, I'd like to introduce you to Sarah Doherty. She's our marketing manager who will be producing today's webinar. Hi, Sarah. And next, I'd like to introduce Tim Sullivan. He is our speaker for today. Hi, Tim. Tim is our VP of Partners and Alliances and has worked with many of our customers to build agile sales processes that fit their sales organizations. So, Tim, I'm going to hand it over to you to get us started and walk us through the agenda.
Thank you, Megan. Appreciate it. Sarah, thanks for helping me out here today as well. We really want to cover four main topics today. Most sales teams have some kind of a definition of how they want to engage with their customers. They define sales process as a kind of idealized way of engaging with customers and candidly trying to close business with them. But what we're finding, and the reason we wanted to do this webinar, is that some of the traditional definitions of sales process are suffering some stresses, shall we say, based on changes in buyer behavior and other factors, which we'll cover today. So there are four main topics that I really want to cover today. First of all, we want to explore how changes in buyer behavior is creating some tension with modern sales process design. And secondly, how you can then balance the need for both flexibility and discipline in how you determine the most effective way to engage with customers and to define that in a sales process design. And then next, we want to cover four components which we think are really necessary in order to reinvigorate your process designs and make them more relevant to selling to modern buyers today. And so we're going to cover four components of agile thinking that should be incorporated into how you put together your process. And then finally, we'll cover briefly some of the values of incorporating that thinking and building an agile sales process. As Megan mentioned, we'll be taking questions here. I think we got about 30 minutes of content, but we'll have some time at the end. As we're going along, if you can enter your questions in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end of the session, if not during the proceedings here. Let's start with a quick poll, if you don't mind. I'd like to see who is struggling with the issue of sales process. I'd like to understand, if you don't mind, how well your sales organization is currently using your sales process definition. And if you don't have one, we have an option here at the end. Please indicate the best answer. You use your sales process all the time. Everyone is very disciplined about using it. You use it most of the time, but not all the time. You use it some of the time. They use it rarely, don't use it at all, or you don't have a sales process. So if you could go ahead and complete the most appropriate answer as it relates to your particular organization and sales team. Great. Let's see what kind of answers we have here. Fantastic. Sarah, if you could display those. Oh, here we go. So we have a pretty disciplined audience here, but with some room for improvement. We've got 16% saying that they use sales process all the time. A little over a quarter, 26% use it most of the time. A little more than half say we use it some of the time, but not all the time. Not a consistent application of your sales process. And we have 3% of you who said you don't have a sales process at all. Okay, well, great. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit more then about how sales process can make a difference in your organization and how you might be able to create something that matches how your buyers prefer to buy. So why is this important? All right, well, 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, in November of 2013, the Harvard Business Review published an article called Dismantling the Sales Machine. So in that particular article, the authors argued that sellers should abandon very rigorously defined sales process and how they are engaging with their customers, and instead give customers what they really want, which is flexibility, insights, and a focus on results. And it was true then, and it's even more true today. The need for flexibility in how you align with different kinds of buyers as they're progressing through their journey towards a decision for the solutions they want to acquire has actually become even more complex. In fact, Gartner has shared in their latest research that on average for most business-to-business opportunities, about 6 to 10 stakeholders are involved in the evaluation process. And in fact, for more complex or sophisticated solutions, that number can be twice that number. So there are many more stakeholders that are involved in the evaluation process in the buyer journey to selecting a decision. So that's gotten more complex for sure. Also, buyers have more access to information than ever before. Even 10 years ago, there was a lot of information, and today, in fact, the problem that many buyers have is that they're overwhelmed with information. And one of the things that sellers can do is help them to filter that out. But that means that they're fully empowered to evaluate different alternatives today. So that means that buyers are demanding more flexibility in working with a wider variety of stakeholders and helping them to filter information and get the right information so they can make a good decision. And in fact, because there are more people involved and because there's more information involved, we're also seeing an increase in the number of opportunities that result in no action at all or no decision, basically maintaining the status quo because they can't evaluate the risks appropriately. So they would like to see sellers be infinitely flexible in how they adapt to all of their individual and collective needs. Managers, on the other hand, sales managers need to have some kind of discipline. There needs to be some standard of what good looks like for how we engage with our customers and buyers of our solutions. And otherwise, it makes it very difficult for them to be able to forecast accurately or to coach according to standards of excellence. It also makes it difficult for them to allocate resources, support resources, and internal kinds of important functions like legal and financial kinds of resources to help the sales team move that opportunity to a close. Knowing when and how to engage with them without any kind of sales process discipline becomes a very problematic kind of activity. So managers want a very well-defined, disciplined sales process so they have a clear definition of what good looks like. And of course, sellers are caught in between the demands for infinite flexibility from buyers and the need for discipline. And of course, they find value in both aspects. And so how do we balance this? How do we balance the need for flexibility and discipline in our sales process definitions? Sarah, if I can ask you to move to the next slide, please. We don't think that you should abandon traditional sales process models. I mean, there's still a lot of value in defining what a good seller action or sales motions should be and aligning with your various buyer constituents, guiding them to a decision. And most of the organizations that we work with, and you saw this from the poll earlier, have some kind of definition of the sales process steps and actions that their team needs to take in order to help customers move to a buying decision. A good sales process definition traditionally has also incorporated some identification of what the buyer journey is. What are the steps in the customer buying process? And as you can see from this chart, that can be very simple processes, or it could be more complex. We have clients that have 4-step, highly transactional kinds of processes. Buyers move from latency to awareness to evaluation to a decision. And when we have some customers that have as many as 12 or even more step processes for sophisticated kinds of solutions that have major strategic impact, and there are many stakeholders involved. The number of steps is not the important thing here. It's how we define our process relative to the kinds of best practices that we want our sellers to be able to execute consistently. And so a good sales process design includes sales actions and methods, and then also verifiable outcomes, or basically checkpoints, if you will, based on observable buyer behavior that will tell a seller and their manager how well they have aligned with the buyer as they are progressing through their journey towards a decision. Verifiable outcomes are the things that managers can use to coach and inspect the quality of opportunities. And those are still important today. And then, of course, it's also helpful to define what resources or tools you can bring at various steps of your sales engagement process that could be helpful there. And then also define how managers need to interact with that process in order to classify the opportunity, forecast the revenue, and bring the right resources to bear. So these are the various components of what a good traditional sales process model should look like. And as I said, this is still valuable. However, there are challenges with this model, some of which I've mentioned previously. Number one, the number of stakeholders that has become involved has certainly increased fairly dramatically, especially in the last 10 years since that original HBR article was written. And also those stakeholders can be engaged at different parts of the process. They can come in and move out. Some of them are involved at the beginning, some are involved in the middle, some at the end. So there's more people involved, typically in B2B kinds of sales opportunities that salespeople need to manage effectively. There's also higher complexity that's involved in evaluation. So there's more different variants, if you will, in how sellers need to apply their process definition to different kinds of opportunities. And also, we have seen that sales process progression is much less linear. This model assumes sort of a linear progression through stage gates in the buyer journey as identified by verifiable outcomes, ultimately to a decision. But as different stakeholders get involved and as buyers interact with different kinds of solution alternatives and learn new things, they can iterate on different steps of the process. I mean, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the term analysis paralysis, where different stakeholders are involved in constant reviews of different kinds of aspects of your solution. And so you can get stuck in those stages as sellers are trying to help them move forward. So it's certainly much less linear than it has been in the past and much more iterative. Also, selling is a lot more obscure than it was even 10 years ago. We've seen the rise of involvement in procurement and purchasing organizations and departments. They're involved earlier, and also they tend to want to control information flow to sellers, and as a result, it's much more difficult. It's very rare today to find opportunities where there's a pure transparency between the seller and the buyer and sharing information. They see that as a way to leverage their position and be able to negotiate better terms when they ultimately select their solution. So certainly, it's much more difficult to get an accurate picture on what's happening inside buying organizations today. And most importantly, it's much less uniform. Today, we work with many organizations that sell point solutions that are more transactional, all the way up to highly complex or sophisticated solutions that are more strategic to the customer. And so the ability to have one sales process design that is a one size fits all really isn't very practical. At the very least, we want to see some variance for more transactional to strategic kinds of engagements with customers. So while this model is a good first step in defining how you want to engage with customers and give them a good buying experience, it really, as a result of these challenges, is much less relevant today and presents some real challenges for both sellers and managers to be able to manage their opportunities and their business, their pipelines, using this kind of model. Let's move to the next slide, please. So, what are we to do about this? Well, one of the things that we think are really important in helping organizations to build an approach to defining how you want your sales team to engage with customers is to incorporate agile thinking. Agile thinking is the ability to assess the status of the buyer accurately and then execute those actions that help the buyer to progress towards a decision. And there are 4 principles of agile thinking that we think modern sales processes should incorporate in order to better align with where buyers are and their buyer behavior. First of all, we think that you should focus on sprints of activities, not just progressing through the various stages to get to the next gate or the next verifiable outcome. We'll talk a little bit more about sprints in a minute. We also think the focus should be on selecting the right sales motions aligned to different buyer scenarios and not on the rote completion of checklists of defined sales motions or activities, which you typically find in most traditional sales process designs. And then next, we think that the focus should be on scalability, that is, selecting the right motions that align with that particular opportunity and stakeholders as you're engaging with them, and not focusing entirely on compliance in your traditional kinds of sales process definitions of sales activities. And then finally, and this is, I think, very important, sellers should focus not just on the stage that they're in and working with the buyer to help them progress, but also to consider the state of that opportunity and of different stakeholders. As I mentioned, stakeholders can come in and out of opportunities during the course of the buyer journey. And so understanding the state of the opportunity relative to how those stakeholders feel about your solution and how favorable they are to us is probably as important, if not more important, than where we are in aligning with them on their buyer journey towards a decision. So let's cover each of those in a little bit more detail. Sarah, if you can move to the next slide, please. Go ahead and complete the various issues. That's good. Thank you. So what do we mean by sprints? I talked about sprints. Well, sprints come from the software industry in the 1990s. Agile thinking or agile methodology came to the fore in software development. And the idea was to take a linear progression of a project and all the different tasks that are required to complete application development and break that up into smaller bits of units of work that are focused on a very specific objective. And then once we complete that sprint in a relatively short period of time, we can learn from that. And then as new requirements come in and we need to be more responsive, then we can adjust the development of the development effort rather to make sure that we're aligning with the best possible outcomes. So it's an easier way for us to manage complex opportunity or complex projects. And it allows us to be much more responsive and flexible in how we adapt to changes as they come in during the duration of the development. And by applying this to the sales effort and to sales opportunities, it gives us as a sales team the ability to adapt to changes in different stakeholders and also changes in requirements or different needs as they arise in our interaction with the customers. So agile thinking can really make a big difference. In fact, there was a study conducted by MIT that showed that those organizations that are adapting agile thinking to various operations in their business found that their revenue grew 37% faster and their profits were 30% higher than those that had not adopted non-agile thinking. A McKinsey survey recently found that 85% of sales leaders believe that adopting agile working methods will be critical to their success in the coming years. And we completely agree with that. And you can see that here in our thinking about sales process design. Let's move to the next slide here, please. So sprints, not just gates. So one of the principles that we suggested that you need to consider when looking at how you engage with your customers and then defining that in your sales process standards. We think that when sellers are engaging with various stakeholders in the buying organization, they should think about defined units of work that are focused on very specific sales objectives, and then breaking that up into a variety of very specific kinds of outcomes so that they can help the customer to make progress towards a buying decision. We define selling sprints as 3 parts. preparation, the actual engagement with the customer, and then advancing. That is reflecting and thinking about what happened, reassessing the opportunity, and moving on to the next sprint. And so with that structure, it makes it relatively easier for sellers to be more responsive and more flexible in how they deal with different stakeholders and changes in the requirements as they move forward. Move to the next slide, please. And so one of the things that we think are very helpful in order to determine what the sprints should contain is by doing an assessment of the quality of opportunities as you are progressing through each of those sprints. Now, there are a variety of different schema that are available to do opportunity qualification, and they're all very helpful. However, we find that there are limitations for most of these kinds of opportunity assessment schema that are out there, and that many of them are based on seller behavior and not necessarily on observable buyer behavior, which becomes much more objective in determining where we really are in the state of favorability with different stakeholders in an opportunity. We have a schema which we call Opportunity Vitals that is based on observable buyer behavior and different stakeholders and the role of different stakeholders in determining what their relative level of influence and authority is, based on 5 different dimensions, and I'll briefly define those. First of all, we think it's important to identify the pain, that is the critical business issue that you're addressing with this particular buyer or customer, and also potential missed opportunities, things that they're trying to capitalize on. Does the buyer understand and agree with that's an issue that needs to be addressed, and can we clearly define it? What problem are we solving? Next is power. Do we have access to, or can we even identify those with the influence and authority that'll be important stakeholders in making the decision? And do we have the means to gain access to those people? Next is vision. Does the buyer organization and the different stakeholders understand the differentiators that we can bring in our solution? And do they understand how those differentiators can help them to solve their particular problem or capitalize on an opportunity? Next is value. Does the buyer understand the business impact of your solution, and is it sufficient for them to take action? And then finally, consensus. And that is, how can you get all the different stakeholders together to agree that they can move forward with the decision? And the way we do that is by identifying those actions that are necessary for them to mitigate any perception of risk that they may have in acquiring and implementing that particular solution. So we can build scalable, observable behaviors for each of these dimensions, and therefore allow sellers to evaluate where they are in that particular opportunity. We can do an initial assessment and then conduct a sprint and then go back and do another assessment, see how we've made progress. And what this will tell us is, where do we need to focus our activity in order to help make progress towards a buying decision? If you could move to the next slide, please. Let's take a poll here. I'd like to understand how well the audience here is actually doing assessments of opportunities in your own organizations. And so how rigorously does your sales organization qualify sales opportunities? Do they have a defined criteria they can use all of the time, most of the time, some of the time, not very often, or you basically don't do opportunity qualification and allow your team to kind of wing it as they're going along? So if you could select the most appropriate answer for your sales team, this should be somewhat interesting. Think about how you define and qualify good opportunities, and how well does your team use that criteria, or how consistently do they use it to the opportunities in your organization? And here we are. Okay, interesting. Normally distributed, as we typically see. So we've got about 1/4, 26%, that are using opportunity qualification all of the time. About 40%, which is a little higher than we usually see, using it most of the time, but not all of the time. Another 1/4, about 23%, using it some of the time, but not consistently. and then 6% not very often, and another 6% who never do it. So this is typically what we see, that people do have some criteria for evaluating the quality of opportunities, but it's not consistently applied. But if we use agile thinking and objective data, then it becomes easier for sellers to apply. And then we can then create sprints that are scalable to that particular opportunity within the context of a sales process definition. So as we're working with different stakeholders, and we see that we need to make progress in helping the buyer to define the problem to be solved, or how we can identify the potential missed opportunity if they don't take action, we can build a sprint of activity where we can prepare, engage in advance to help them to do exactly that. And because we might have multiple stakeholders, we may have to do that multiple times as we are working with the buyer through their journey. We may also develop sprints for getting access to different people with influence and authority, or help them to understand the different differentiators that we can provide, or help them to recognize the value or the business impact of our solutions and seeing that it's sufficient to take action. Or finally, what are all the different actions we can take to help them to mitigate their perception of risk and make it easier for them to buy as a team. So this enables us to be much more scalable in how we work with different customers, from transactional all the way up to more sophisticated, complex sales opportunities. You move to the next slide, please. And then finally, focusing on state and not just stage. I've already alluded to this a little earlier. We do think it is important to define some definition of an ideal buyer journey and how you interact with that. So it's helpful to have definitions of how your customers move from a latent state to an awareness state, to evaluating, and then selecting, and then finally closing and implementing that solution. And also identifying verifiable outcomes, that is, things, buyer behaviors that tell us that we're in alignment with them at that step. That is still very useful for managers and sellers to have. But we also recognize now that because opportunities are more iterative and different stakeholders can be involved at different steps of the process, and some of them can be involved in the middle and then drop out and come back or whatever. So there's different stakeholders that play a role in evaluations depending on the complexity or sophistication of your solution. And then using opportunity assessment, using opportunity vitals to identify the different sprints that are required in each phase, we can then measure the state of different stakeholders and their favorability to our solution as we are progressing through the buyer journey. So while it's very important to identify how we take an action and whether or not we're in alignment with different stakeholders, to also use the opportunity assessment to determine the state of different stakeholders and see that we're making forward progress is equally important, and also allows us to be more flexible in how we adapt our sales motions to the unique needs of different opportunities. So an agile sales process model looks not only at the stage that we're in, but also the state of different stakeholders as they're progressing in their journey. So there's a lot of value in adopting these kinds of principles to agile sales process. And of course, there's a lot more detail that we can provide to you on this, but we wanted to give you an idea conceptually of how we think sales process is evolving. And if you adopt agile thinking into sales process definitions, we think it provides a lot of unique kinds of benefits. Number one, it does provide more flexibility and also provide some definition that sales managers and sellers can use to provide the discipline necessary so that they can forecast accurately, coach, and be able to bring in the right resources when necessary. Also, it's more responsive to different types of sales opportunities. It's much more scalable to different sizes of opportunities. And also, you can objectively determine the quality of opportunities, so you can disengage from bad deals earlier in the process. You can engage the right resources effectively. It does provide managers with standards for filtering opportunities so they can qualify and then forecast more accurately. And it does provide sellers, especially new sellers, with a clear map of success that they can use for onboarding and becoming productive more rapidly. So I hope that we've challenged your thinking a little bit with some of this ideas around incorporating agility into traditional sales process design to help balance flexibility and discipline. So let me turn it over to you, Megan.
Thanks, Tim. Good 30 minutes. Before we get to, I think we have time for one question, and we had one come in over the chat function. We have 2 QR codes here on the screen that you can scan with your camera on your phone and have access to 2 free, I would say, a thought leadership piece up top, recharging your sales process with seller agility. It's a little bit more detailed version of what Tim spoke through today. And then the second QR code is a brochure about how Richardson can help you build a sales process for your sales organization. Okay, so we have one question, Tim, before we close out here. If an agile sales process is highly flexible, what does that mean that there is no clear definition of selling motions as an ideal standard for the team?
Right.
Good question.
Yeah, this is what was kind of proposed in the original HBR article, and the answer to that question is no. We still think that it's important to have some definition of what an ideal customer journey should look like. In other words, define what a good customer experience should be, so you have some existing standard. But in actual application, we think that using the opportunity vitals to determine what units of work are necessary in order to make progress with different stakeholders should be the primary determinant as to what sales motions and actions from that ideal sales process design should be applied. And that gives you the flexibility to scale within a particular opportunity. So it's good to have a definition of what good looks like, but understand in actual application, we may adjust that to different situations.
That's great. Thank you, Tim. And I hope that answered that question. All righty. So I think we are up for time. I do want to be mindful. I'm sure everybody has meetings to get to. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. You will get a copy of the slides and the recording right after this from Sarah Doherty. Tim, thank you for a great 30 minutes. Sarah, thank you for all of your support. Again, here on the screen, you'll see a QR code and that links to our LinkedIn profile. We are sharing complimentary thought leadership every day. Be sure to follow us. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you guys soon.